Hello and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Jason Memmel, one of your co-hosts. I've got with me Deacon John. Do you want to say hello there, John?
Hello, everybody.
Hello. And today we've got with us Dr. Andrew Jacobs, who's recently released a book called Gospel Thrillers. And that's a thing that maybe as soon as you hear that title, you might have a sense of what it is. And yet it's still something that he kind of discovered. Andrew, do you want to say hello and give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
Sure. My name's Andrew Jacobs, as you said. I am by training a scholar of early Christianity. For about 25 years, I've taught religious studies, ancient religion, religion of antiquity, biblical studies in various forms. A lot of that career was in California. For 8 years, I was in the Boston area, and I've just relocated to Charlottesville, Virginia, where I am an advisor and lecturer at the University of Virginia.
Very
Oh,
cool.
that's amazing. Yeah.
Well,
Thanks.
we'll launch right into it, which is your book examines quote unquote gospel thrillers as a unique fictional genre. It reflects anxieties about the Bible. As a historian of early Christianity by training, what drew you to study this sort of niche area? Right, it's not something that I think a lot of people would associate with, say, the first century or very serious, in-depth religious studies. What drew you into looking at this popular fiction? Maybe fiction that people would even turn their nose down. And how did your academic background influence your approach?
So I came upon this project by accident. It was probably more than 20 years ago. I was in a used bookstore in Virginia, which the bookstore no longer exists because that was a different time. But I came across probably 2 or 3 of these, and they were shelved with historical fiction, which they're not. So they were shelved with things like Ben-Hur and The Robe, like kind of biblical fiction. And they were sort of fascinating. They were both from the 70s. So I thought this was a kind of like flippy genre, but I thought it was sort of interesting and interesting enough as a window into what people thought academics were like that I gave a kind of funny talk at one of my academic conferences about it. So this is how we come off. And this was around the time of like the Vinci Code, which had another very odd but revealing idea of what people thought professors of religious studies might be like. So I gave this talk and I thought, well, maybe there's something there, but I don't know. And I kept on my merry way doing my early Christian studies and religion in late antiquity, books and articles and so on. A lot of this time I was still teaching biblical studies. And in fact, one of the classes that's been one of my staple classes is on biblical fiction. So fictional retellings of biblical stories from antiquity to the present. So I always had a kind of foot in popular cultural representations of biblical narratives. And I really loved teaching that class from like the first year I taught as an assistant professor.
Yeah.
Over time, I realized there were actually quite a number of these books. The more I looked, the more there were. As you say, this was not a sort of self-defined genre, so I would have to be very creative in how I looked for it. Some of this was the early days of Amazon, where I would go to bookstores, or I would just sort of look through libraries and try to look for like archeological fiction or something like that. But eventually I amassed enough of these from the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 2000s that I thought, okay, there is something actually going on here. And this is really a kind of intersection of teaching and research, which is kind of the dream for academics. I'm teaching in these various topics about the Bible to students who have particular kinds of questions. I'm thinking about the kinds of questions that we as scholars ask, which is very 20th, 21st century kind of set of questions to ask. Why do we think of missing gospels, reconstructing gospels? What is modern biblical studies as a discipline? What's driving it? And then I had these novels, which I will confess in the first minutes of this broadcast, I'm not a huge thriller fan. If you had told me in the early 2000s that I was going to end up reading like 36 of these and taking copious notes on them and trying to deconstruct their methods and their cultural implications, I would have been a little distressed, but I'm glad I did it. It was a really amazing project to really think about from a kind of metacritical perspective. What are the things that we as scholars of religion think we're doing? What do other people think we're doing? And what are those common desires and impulses that drive both of those things?
Yeah.
Well, and
Go ahead.
and I was going to say, like, and I think also, as you note in the book, how this particular, I think you used the word totemic relationship that people have with the Bible as a term, as a its own symbol, and how that is sort of specifically connected to that same sort of metacritical narrative that you're talking about, like the a fictional academic of a totem versus a actual academic of a codex of texts, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting intersection.
The very first class I taught as an assistant professor in 2001 in California was an introduction to the Bible. And it was 350 students, something like that. And, we're all trained how to teach that kind of class. It's historical criticism. It's not confessional. We're not trying to teach the students like what the Bible means, but it's a very particular approach. And that's how I taught it. And that's how I taught it for a long time. And, we can try to tell ourselves that the reason students will take a class is because they're these fascinating ancient texts, but that's not true, right? They take it because it's the Bible. Even though one of the things we'll tell them is there's no such thing as the Bible. Nonetheless, we're not going to teach a class called Introduction to that thing you thought is the Bible, but really there's no such thing as the Bible, right? We know what the interest is in this text. It has a particular cultural power. And, over the decades I've taught biblical studies, I've tried to contextualize that historical criticism more and more as a particular method with a particular history. Like this is a no more natural way to read this set of texts than any other. But I also center the fact that there's a reason we are interested in this body of text. It's not, as you say, it's not a codex, right? We don't actually have a codex of the Bible from antiquity or any time. We have lots of codices of lots of different things, but the Bible is a thing we have produced in the modern era after centuries of other kinds of production, and it serves certain kinds of purposes and functions in our society. And these novels, interestingly, even though they're very formulaic, and we can talk about that too, they understand that. Like they understand both the desire for that totemic thing to be a thing, but also they understand that thing is something we've made up. And we are constantly reproducing and revising and restructuring as we go along. So it is a totem in the sense that it's a thing we built, but it's a totem also in the sense that we invest it with lots of meaning that we hope for and want to be persistent, even though we know deep down it's very fragile and precarious.
Well, and there's something there too about like how it's like even the tension inside those novels is that like the Da Vinci Code is this like prime example of it is that there's this awareness that something has been chosen, that there's been a process of editing, but that the stuff that has been edited has some kind of like supernatural importance. Do you know what I mean? So like an ontological importance other than simply a lost text. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's and so that this particular piece of information will blow the lid off of everything, is I think it's both kind of this like acknowledgement and rebuttal to that feeling, if that makes sense.
And it's supernatural, but also political. Like that's another thing these novels reveal very clearly is that the fears and desires around the Bible are not just that it is somehow a source of truth, but it is a source of power, right? It is a source of coherence for groups of people around which they understand their identity. And to threaten that might be to threaten something we call religion, but it is also to threaten that reality. And that's where there's this sort of fascinating dovetail between Americanness, which has connotations of kind of whiteness and maleness and all sorts of things going with it, and biblical religion, which is Christianity, which is Protestant Christianity, which is a very particular kind of mainstream Protestant Christianity. Its power is in content in part, but also in context that creates this center of gravity that we both want to be there, but we're also suspicious of why the center of gravity should be the center of gravity for whatever this American US identity is.
And from a kind of a publishing perspective, like if you were thinking of this like economically, is it that because there was an audience, like the reason this kind of grows up, it may be starting in the 70s maybe, is because there's an audience of like American Protestant biblical Christians that are of a big enough number that this starts to turn into a thing that like if you write one of these books, people will buy it. Does that make sense? Like
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is something, this is just data I do not have. I don't have data on why publishers decided to publish these. I don't have data on who bought and read them. I can look at things like advertisements. So the first one that I found is really from the 1960s. It was this book, The Q Document, and it was a hardback and then a paperback. It was published by Harper Morrow, which is a very mainstream press. It had advertisements in major newspapers around the country. It was never, as far as I could tell, a bestseller, but it probably sold pretty well. Um, I can tell you what the advertising looked like and what it appealed to, and it very much was a Cold War thriller, but centered on biblical discovery. So I can't even say this is something people were drawn to for religious reasons. I don't know that that's true. There are like a tiny handful of books in this genre that were published mainly in the 90s and early 2000s by evangelical presses. So clearly there was a desire for this kind of story with a very particular kind of twist, affirming the truth of the Bible for this audience. But that's just a few. The vast majority of these are secular presses, secular authors, and presumably in the sense that people are buying books alongside other kinds of books, secular readers. That is to say, even if these people might have religious inclinations in other parts of their life, this book is not being marketed to them as addressing your faith or addressing your religion. So in that sense, they are a secular phenomenon. I wish I could say how well they sold. There was one from the 1970s that was just a blockbuster, but it was written by a blockbuster author. So it's The Word by Irving Wallace in 1972. Irving Wallace is already a super duper best-selling pot boiler author, wrote these massive books full of like sex and intrigue, and this was another one of them. And like his other books, it was a bestseller for a long time, and it was made into a miniseries. Is that because of the topic, or does the topic fit into this because the genre had certain kinds of expectations and formulas that allowed the Bible as an object of kind of thriller conspiratorial thinking to slot in ways the same way that nuclear secrets could, or government intrigue, or the other kind of topics we might expect for thrillers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Somehow the Bible becomes another one of these topics. That's what became fascinating to me, is how is the Bible an object of conspiratorial thinking, particularly seemingly starting in the 60s and going into the present? Like this is a Cold War, post-Cold War phenomenon. There are lost gospel kinds of stories that people are telling before that, but they're different kinds of stories. They have a different kind of politics and a different kind of generic structure to them. They tend to be more like swashbuckly adventure stories of the kind that Indiana Jones was sort of lampooning in the 80s or refashioning in the 80s, but in a more serious way, like that kind of novel. But it's the 60s that when we get thrillers, which are about conspiracy and shadowy forces and secrets that people stumble upon, and somehow the Bible becomes one of those secrets that people both want to uncover, but also maybe don't want to be completely dislodged.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's and I'm thinking of that Nick Cage movie, National Treasure, as an example, not of a biblical thriller, but like a like vaguely important text thriller. Do you know what I mean? Like the text of the movie never engages with the text of the Declaration of Independence. Like,
no, it's the thing itself, right? It's this totem that has a secret literally, on the back of it or something. I can't remember. It's been 20 years since that movie came out, but it was a similar sort of thing. And also it was this sort of maverick archaeologist who's uncovering this stuff, right? With the help of someone on the inside, which is also an interesting aspect of this kind of conspiratorial thriller. There's usually some kind of knowledge broker who has access to the files or the papers or the thing, who then becomes an accomplice for the protagonist who is somehow outside the system but comes up upon the secret. I mean, if I describe the formula of a gospel thriller to you, it sounds very much like any other kind of thriller from this era, right? It is about a protagonist who stumbles upon a secret that leads him, usually like 99% of the time, him, to uncover some unfolding, ongoing attempt to cover up or hide a truth that must be so significant that lots of people, political forces, geopolitical powers are working together to both cover up and hide and hide this secret from the world. So it must be something explosive and important and dangerous. There's always danger. There's a kind of clock that gets into motion, and often these thrillers will have like a date and a place at the beginning of every chapter because the hero is traveling around the world trying to find clues. There's always clues that are, on the one hand, often in plain sight, but difficult to decode, and they lead to the next clue. This is all the trappings, the aesthetics of both conspiracy thinking in the real world and the genre of the thriller.
Mm.
What's fascinating is what happens when you slot in. The secret is there is a gospel from the first century. It comes from the hand of someone who knew Jesus or Jesus himself. And it discloses something that, if it's true, overturns everything we thought we knew about Jesus, Christianity, and therefore Western culture writ large.
Mhm.
And it's either been discovered and people are trying to get a hold of it, or it's rumored to exist and people are trying to find it.
Mhm.
And that's the basic plot. And it's often found. Sometimes it's not found. Sometimes we, the reader, don't actually know what the content of this gospel is. It's enough to know that the Bible is in danger. Maybe the Bible should be in danger. That's what some of these
Yeah.
novels posit. The Bible itself becomes a conspiracy. This is truth that was kept out of the Bible. And the very Bible itself is perpetuating a conspiracy of silence around this true thing.
Mhm.
Or maybe it affirms the Bible, although that's rarely kind of true. Or it affirms something about Jesus that people want to be true, apart from the texts that have already circulated around it. Formulaically, these are not surprising sort of novels. They are much like any other thriller you could read, except the shadowy forces at work are trying to hide something about the Bible.
Mhm. And there's like, we're going again a bit off this question sheet, but Jonathan, we could bring it back, back to the plan at some point. But the thing that keeps striking me on this too is that, I mean, obviously you're on a show called Talk Gnosis. John and I both identify as Gnostics of some stripe. I would argue that we are fairly how's the right way to say it? Conspiratorial in our approach, but it's definitely in the milieu of Gnosticism to think conspiratorially about the Bible and about religion. And that, like, part of the whole, one of the defining characteristics of Gnosticism was literally finding more gospels in the 20th century, that changed people's perceptions of what that was going to be. And then, like, literally a whole academic, I guess, process that was focusing on the fact that these were edited out. Like, it was like creating Gnosticism as an ancient, not just heresy, but like a counterculture. And so it's like, in many ways, I think Gnostics like discover this stuff. And I think the Da Vinci Code was kind of for a lot of folks who had never encountered Gnosticism, doing a lot of Googling after the Da Vinci Code led them to these things that actually exist, and started going like, oh wait, so that, like, that itch, that like spiritual itch that got scratched by the thriller idea, I can actually now examine in reality, in a much less exciting reality, because there's no, secret Catholic.
One
Just
hopes. Yeah.
one hope. Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, just in the sense that, like, we've been doing this podcast for a while. I'm not hard to find. I think if somebody was trying to silence me, it would happen by now.
Yes,
But
no creepy albino monks have shown up at my house to
yeah.
assassinate me. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that I guess I knew that a little bit, that Da Vinci Code inspired people to look up Gnostic stuff, because it's, just as a side note, it so totally misrepresents what's in actual sort of Gnostic texts, like
Yeah.
almost 180
100.
degrees
Yeah.
misrepresentation. Like, it's fascinating. But yes, I do remember when the Da Vinci Code came out and I was a professor teaching biblical studies and Christianity, I was called upon to talk about this a lot. And it was very clear, at least in Southern California, where I was living and teaching, that a lot of the appeal of this was precisely because we were in the midst of a fairly, or in the dawn, well, no, midst of a fairly right-wing Christian culture ascendancy in politics, that people found this to be a refreshing blow against that in various ways. That it dislodged what was perceived to be a kind of political and biblical fundamentalism, right? That the Bible was true. And in that sense, you're right. It's not conspiratorial in the sense of shadowy networks trying to come at you, but it's kind of soft conspiracy. And I say this because even if you read like Gnostic Gospels, like Elaine Pagels, there's a sense in which, I mean, she uses the word suppression, that these are things that have been suppressed. That is not a neutral or an agentless activity, right? They're agents of suppression. They may not be violent. They may not be coming to find you. But the idea is that these things had to resurface because they had been suppressed for centuries. I would even go further and say it's probably not just Gnostics that have this kind of soft conspiratorial thinking, but biblical studies itself is grounded in a kind of soft conspiracism, which is to say, the fundamental tenet of modern biblical criticism is that the Bible as we have it, and I mean the Christian Bible, this is always the Christian Bible, is the product of revision, redaction, suppression, editing, and creativity, which means that the story of Jesus as it is in the four Gospels is the end result of a process of selection, of revision, of editing, and of leaving things out. That's a basic tenet. I'm not trying to frame biblical studies as being conspiratorial. When
Mm-mm.
you take a class on the Synoptic Gospels, the very idea, the question that that term raises is we have three Gospels, which you can read side by side, synoptic, and yet they are not the same. How do we explain their similarity and their difference? And what we have generated is an entire narrative of people writing a new story out of the old story. And it's treated historically, contextually, neutrally. But the idea is that if you want to know the real story, you have to work your way back through this process of revision. And to do that, you need new discoveries, new methods to reconstruct. They don't use the term original anymore. Like we're recovering an original New Testament, but they use terms like, I don't remember, basically the point, the earliest we can recover, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a fundamental idea that there have been acts of deliberate suppression and alteration in the story of Christianity over time. And what modern scholars are doing is addressing that, acknowledging it, studying it, but also in some cases trying to undo that or move past that or work past that. And I would say that that impulse is similar to the impulse you're describing with respect to the rediscovery of Gnostic texts in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because it's about trying to work past what are not necessarily perceived to be violent or threatening acts of suppression, but are nonetheless acts of suppression, which are central to the production of the Bible. And there's, of course, a timing issue, right? So these major discoveries of the 1940s, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi codices, are taking place in this post-World War II, early days of the Cold War, decolonization of the Middle East, which is also changing our understanding of the places from which the biblical stories come, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just that new texts come out which are non-biblical or counter-biblical or open up new ways of understanding alternatives to the biblical story. At the same time, the very understanding of the biblical story is undergoing a shift because of that geopolitical fracture, which is both a post-colonial fracture, that is to say that the Ottoman Empire falls, the European mandates are dissolved, and suddenly we have these new independent nation states like Egypt and Israel, and a kind of Cold War mistrust of information as it is given to us by this massive bureaucratic government, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
the idea that there might be perpetual acts of misrepresentation at the national, federal, global level.
But I do have an important sort of obvious question, which is we keep referring to the book as gospel thrillers, but its actual title is Gospel Thrillers, Conspiracy Fiction, and the Vulnerable Bible.
Yeah.
And you talk about this concept of the vulnerable Bible within the book. I was wondering if you can explain what that means, how it's vulnerable in the U.S. imaginary, and how the narratives within gospel thrillers sort of amplify both these fears and these desires.
Yeah, so it follows from what I was just saying, this idea that there comes to be an awareness really beginning in the 19th century in the kind of official professional sense that the Bible is a product of editing. And we use the word redaction because that's the German word and this all comes from Germans, but that there was a product of textual transmission and editing over time, which caused a little bit of a crisis among professional students of the Bible in the 19th century, because this idea of higher criticism, which is the idea that the biblical books we have are edited versions of earlier sources, some of which may be lost. And this was applied to both the Jewish scriptures and the New Testament. But this idea led very naturally to a lot of professors saying, and therefore, of course, the Bible can't be trusted to give accurate information because it's altered sources that have been lost. And this set off a bit of a crisis it led to the birth of what we now know as a kind of fundamentalist school of the Bible, but it also led to actual archaeology and paleography. This is what set the Bible hunters of the 19th century off into monasteries and off into the Middle East to find older original copies of the Bible, precisely to affirm, oh no, the Bible we have is actually reliable. And so they began this project of reconstructing the original Bible, primarily in the service of affirming the text of the Bible that we've received, what they called the Textus Receptus, the received text of the Bible. Over time, of course, the logic of that becomes, well, the more we are discovering, the more we are able to now break apart the Bible we have. And in fact, we're going to produce new editions of this received text. So you have the first critical edition of the New Testament, which is to say, based on the earliest textual sources and indicating where they disagree. So at the top of the page, you have to imagine a reconstructed text in big letters, and the bottom of the page, all these tiny little footnotes, which refer to individual specific manuscripts and shows where there are variations. So you, the expert, can look at the reconstruction and the kind of math that it's based on beneath. So the first version of that is published in, let's say, the 1880s. We're now coming up on the 29th edition of this, which means that in the past 140 years, enough changes have been made to this reconstructed text that it was deemed important enough to republish it 28 times. That's a vulnerable Bible. That is a Bible which every day is subject to revision and emendation based on new discoveries and new methods and theories. Because it's not just that we find new texts, we have new ways of understanding the relationship between texts over time. So new discoveries and new methods and theories are going to lead us to reconstruct, revise over and over again this text. This is what modern biblical studies does. This is the kind of bread and butter of what we call textual criticism. And it produces a Bible that is in flux. And obviously, we would not imagine in a routine as we go about our business day that scholars are acting with malice or mischief in this process. What these novels do is they do imagine that there could be malice or mischief in this process. Today, yesterday, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, right? That this process has always been subject to personal, political, and theological interests, which are often not articulated. But if they're there, surely we have to imagine the Bible vulnerable to these acts of mischief. So the Bible itself becomes vulnerable, which is to say, it can be harmed. I mean, that's what vulnerable means. It can be wounded. I don't think a lot of people think of the Bible in those terms in their everyday life, but there are moments when it becomes, when we become aware of that vulnerability. So there was, for instance, in the 1940s and 1950s is when groups of scholars began trying to produce a new translation of the Bible for the curious lay person who wanted a kind of academic version of the Bible. So in your church, you might have the King James version or the authorized version. This was going to be called the Revised Standard Version. And there was a committee of scholars who were going to look at all the manuscripts. They were going to do that work. They were going to compare all the manuscripts, compare all the texts, compare translations, and they were going to produce a new Old Testament and a New Testament with footnotes to show their work. But it would be a retranslation into modern English that would give you a sense of the original text as they reconstructed it. The New Testament came out in the 40s. People were like, oh, this is sort of interesting. The Old Testament came out in the 50s, and there were newspaper articles accusing these people of being radical communists, right? Because of the way, because they translated, they accused them of producing a consciously anti-Christian translation of the Bible, even though every single person on this committee, except for one person, was a Christian. They all worked in various theological contexts, but mostly liberal sort of theological schools, right? So in that period of time, when the Revised Standard Version fully came out, I'm not saying there were like riots in the street, but there were people who were very suspicious that these scholars had tried to get one over on a gullible public by translating certain terms, like, for instance, this famous verse in Isaiah, behold, a virgin shall conceive. Suddenly now she's a young woman. Well, what happened there, right? What are you trying to pull over our eyes? That reaction only makes sense if people are already primed to think of the Bible as vulnerable to this kind of, as I say, acts of mischief, right? So the Revised Standard Version lives on. There's now a new Revised Standard Version. There's now a new Revised Standard Version, updated edition. But every time these things come out, there will be a blip somewhere of someone who is genuinely suspicious of what it is that people are trying to do with this. Or if there's a new discovery, or if there's the rumor of a new discovery of a text, or a new translation of a text, or a new version of a text. For a long time, the Museum of the Bible, the Green family claimed to have what they called first century Mark, right? They claimed this was a papyrus that had a version of Mark from the first century, which would be vastly older than anything we had. And this was to introduce a note of security and surety against the vulnerability of Mark to people saying, oh, Mark could be from the 80s, Mark might be from 120. People making arguments about dating and meaning that could call into question the Bible. So yeah, vulnerability is this sort of always simmering awareness that the Bible as we have it, this totem of often US identity, is vulnerable to, on a good day, just the routine academic processes of revision and redaction. On a bad day, people really trying to mess with the Bible.
To put something in there.
Or take something out.
Or take something out. Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah.
So, if you look at a modern translation of the Gospel of John, for instance, 9 out of 10 scholars will agree that the woman taken in adultery is a story that was added into this chapter of the Gospel of John, not original to the text. And we've got, there's books and books about this, right? Unlike other questionable passages, if you look at the NRSV, the NRSVU, it's still in there. And what they'll do is they'll put like brackets around it with like big footnotes. They will not take it out. That's a bridge too far, right? If they took that out, people would not accept this revised Bible. Other things they'll take out, they'll put in a little footnote. Other ancient sources say, but not this, right?
Yeah.
That is also an awareness of how far are we willing to mess with the vulnerability of the Bible.
Just very briefly, but only because it kind of reminds me of it when you said a bridge too far. What immediately came to mind, and listeners and watchers of the show might have heard me maybe tell this story before, but there was a friend of mine I had on Facebook, huge atheist, like evangelical atheist, I would say, like in the sense that I must convert everyone to atheism, and huge Star Wars fan, enormous Star Wars fan. And the reason I mention this is because he had a blog post explaining how the flood could never have actually happened, and therefore the Bible is obviously fiction. Then this next post was reacting with upset because Disney had rendered all of the extended universe Star Wars stories legendary. And I was like, so you're upset that someone has taken a text that's important to you and said it is only slightly more fictional than it already was. And this is a bridge too far for you. And just I thought that was an interesting moment of both your story and that, to me, highlight the importance we hold to certain mythological texts, and in his case, a pop culture mythological text.
Dr. Jacobs, you're a professor of symbology at Harvard, so I'm your days are spent with popes and presidents contacting you for important missions, where you travel around the world on jets, and attractive men and women throw themselves at you. But I was what I'm wondering is, I guess, three nestled, interconnected questions, which is, you've read dozens and dozens of these books. Were any of them good? Like, were any of them like, can you say, hey, that this is a pop culture thriller, but it's actually well written, well plotted. The prose is surprisingly good. And two, what surprised you? What was accurate? What was inaccurate about the scholars in these books? Right, just like at the opening of my question, is that an accurate depiction of a biblical scholar's life? What was the worst one? So, were any of them good? What was the worst one? Do any of them accurately? Then, what are the depictions of the biblical scholars' lives like? Are any of them accurate?
So, again, with the caveat that this is not by normal reading fare, I would actually, I think one of the early ones is by Elizabeth Peters. It's called The Dead Sea Cipher, 1970 or 71, I think. And this is an early Elizabeth Peters book. Elizabeth Peters was a pseudonym for an Egyptologist. She would go on to do a much more famous series of mysteries, some set in like Victorian Egypt with like actual Egyptology characters as sort of background figures in these novels. And I like this one. It is well written. Like she's just a good writer of craft. A lot of thrillers have a particular pace that is part of the genre. So you have these like 2 to 3 page chapters, and they're both very wordy but also breathless,
Hmm.
and sort of like big sentences, but then fast paced. So she's a very good as a craftsperson. She was a very good writer. There's actually a woman protagonist, which is rare in these novels. There is a kind of awareness of in a very like low level mass market 1970s kind of way, some of the structural difficulties of being an American tourist in recently decolonized Middle Eastern spaces, which are still subject to American imperialism in various ways. It actually never shows us the text that is at question. So what's happened is that um, a dissolute archaeologist was murdered in her hotel, and it turns out he had discovered a sort of cache of documents along the Dead Sea written in Aramaic. And from this cipher he leaves, it's clear that at least one of them is a life of Jesus, and another's life of Mary. But there are also Aramaic versions of the 4 canonical Gospels and maybe Acts. And we never see that life of Jesus. Like that gets destroyed before we as readers see it. So we're left to sort of wonder what it could be. So it has all the kind of tension of this, but as many of these novels do, it dissolves that tension at the end. But it does it fairly artfully. So I would say that is one that I could, without fear of someone getting mad, recommend as like a good read. It's not too long. It's easily accessible because she's such a famous author. You don't have to like dig through some used bookstore to get it. Bad ones. So I would say one of the ones I found very baffling to read uh, is a book called Book of Judas. The author's last name is Stasi, Stasi. She's a journalist. It's actually in a series. So she started writing a series of, books with a woman protagonist who's a journalist, much like her. The first one is about, I didn't read it, but it's a purported clone of Jesus who turns out not to be a clone of Jesus. So that's not a problem. The second one is about the rediscovery of the missing pieces of the actual Gospel of Judas, like the Gospel of Judas that was, well, its whole story is very fraught, as I talk about in the book, but it came to light in the early 2000s. Let's put it that way,
Hmm. Hmm.
2006. But it had been in horrible condition, and lots of pieces in this codex were lost, and there's missing pieces in the actual thing. So this is an idea that the actual missing pages had been stored away somewhere else, and she, with her former lover, who's some sort of mercenary, are on the track of these. They decode them, but with the help of the Voynich manuscript, which I don't even know what that is. The Voynich manuscript is this,
Oh my God.
medieval, right? So she brings that in, this medieval manuscript that no one knows what it is. It could actually literally be meaningless. But then it also then dabbles in this very odd science fiction turn. And I will say some of these, I think because of the idea that there could be something supernatural about the Bible, obviously, some of them do take a kind of science fictiony or at least mystical turn in several of
Hmm.
these. So there's often, not often, but I'd say in maybe a handful of these, there'll be this idea that there is something mystical happening with one of the characters that is adjacent to the regular operations of the archaeological thriller with protagonist and antagonist. This one gets into theories of the seeding of life on Earth by aliens, which is called like panspermia, if you need to look that up. And it just becomes like narratively a mess. I'm fairly confident this author will never hear me talking about this, so I can just say it.
Yeah.
I don't talk about this one a lot in the book, except as it's among there's a lot that came out after 2007, 8 with the
Hmm.
Gospel of Judas at the center because this was a new gospel. Um,
Hmm.
but it has this sort of, and then all this sort of supernatural stuff just dissolves at the end. Also, it's just a
Hmm.
very odd, like sort of gesture towards. I think the impulse is the secrets that are hidden with a hidden gospel must be of such an enormous magnitude that what if they're not just about Jesus? What if they're not just about Christianity and Western civilization? What if they're about all of human life? Like, what if these are like timeless secrets? And I think that's where she was trying to go, but
Hmm.
she's not, in my opinion, a good writer. The actual narrative is very odd. It's not, there's a lot of stuff about Middle Eastern terrorism, and there's a fairly, I would say, right wing take on that throughout the book, which
Hmm.
is not particularly palatable, even in 2019 when I think it came out. So I would probably give that one a pass. I will say a lot of them more recently, just because of the nature of publishing, and
Hmm.
particularly genre publishing, and thrillers are a genre. So there are lost gospel novels that are more literary or in other kinds of genres, but the vast majority, again, are thrillers. So that's why I focus
Hmm.
on thrillers in this book. They tend to be in series. So if you want
Hmm.
to have a successful publishing career, like the one way to really, in genre, it's to be able to have a series with central protagonists. And you can really, if you can have one a year, I think that's the way to keep a contract, get your next contract going. So a
Hmm.
lot of these really since the 2000, I guess the late 2000s into the 10s and 20s are appearing in series with other sorts of thriller subjects. So,
Hmm.
which is another interesting thing because we have a discovery of the text that's going to change everything, and then the next book starts and it's you
Hmm.
reset to zero, right? They're
Yeah.
on to the next kind of archaeological thing. But that also creates an interesting dynamic where obviously I read these on their own, but they're meant to be read as part of the story of these particular protagonists working their way through all these different conspiratorial settings around the world. Portrayal of academics.
Yep.
We are a multifarious group. We are obviously, you can't say academics are any one thing.
Hmm.
I will say the way academics are portrayed in these books, I would say almost all of these, when they do research, they talk to actual academics. I mean, that's just part of, if you're going to write about a subject where academics are part of it, you want to talk to them and you want to learn stuff about like what's up with Aramaic or something, right? So they're often very sympathetic characters or neutral characters. But, there is a kind of suspicion of academics, which I will say is both totally unwarranted, but 1000% understandable. The unwarranted part is that to simplify this genre that spans decades, scholars are either kind of inside the academy, textual philology types who tend to be feminized, less sort of like they might have useful information, but they are either weak or potentially treacherous. Like that their loyalty is either to themselves or to their sort of little fiefdom of text, and therefore, while that means they know a lot, it also means that they're not really maybe super trustworthy with what they're willing to tell you, this outsider. So there's a kind of
Hmm.
like weedy, feminized, anesthetized kind of figure of the pale, not out in the sun scholar.
Also, not agentic, like not acting in the world, just studying.
No,
You
but also a gatekeeper, right? So
know. Mhm.
they're not out in the world, but they are controlling access to particular kinds of knowledge that
Mhm.
the protagonist needs or wants or something, which means they could be very close to the conspiracies that are keeping this a secret, right?
Mhm.
Contrasted with the kind of sort of fit, tanned, active archaeology type, who obviously has very specific kinds of knowledge also, but is, as you say, agentic. They're out in the world, they're doers. They're also knowers, but their primary function is as doers. So I will say it's actually rare for the protagonists of these novels to be an academic unless they are a kind of archaeological type who's been some degrees removed from actual academia. That is, there's some kind of like rogue archaeologist who no longer holds a regular position, or they publish things that are just so like out there that people don't trust them. They're renegades. There's something like that. So both of these are obviously 10 million% stereotypes that are not accurate at all. I say it's very understandable because um, academics present our work, and this is true of biblical studies too. In secular biblical studies, even I would say, if someone's in a seminary, when they produce professional biblical studies, that is not theology, it is still secular, like in its format, right? It is presented as objectively and depersonalized a manner as possible, right? So your arguments for why a text should be read a certain way or not read a certain way are based on almost scientific sounding notions of how texts operate, how you have arrived at a certain theory based on both material evidence, but philology, which is history of language, which is very difficult if you're not inside that study. So it's very precise, technical kinds of reasoning that make arguments about the biblical text. With any kind of textual interpretation, particularly when it's old or dead languages. But that means that the person of the scholar vanishes, right? This comes as a view from nowhere, right?
Hmm.
You might see my name on a byline, but none of my personhood is relevant to that argument. And I think people outside of the academy are genuinely curious and often suspicious of that view from nowhere.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that scholars have secret motivations, but I'm saying what the novels do is they say, listen, these are people. These
Hmm.
are people who have inner lives. And surely sometimes those inner lives are producing certain types of arguments and revisions and redactions. And what if that those personal motives come into contact with the vulnerable Bible? What's going to happen? So that's why I say it's very understandable, this idea that scholars are either gatekeeping or trying to break open and reveal the truth everywhere, that this is trying to address a tension where the particular kinds of vulnerabilities that people sense in the Bible in terms of politics and theology and personal motivations are, by design, usually absent from the kinds of reasoning that scholars use to argue about what the Bible means and what it says.
Well, you even mentioned earlier Elaine Pagel's framing of some of the Gnostic Gospels in terms of how she discussed their generation and their finding and like that whole process had a slight rogueness to it, even if it's only very slightly. To state like suppression, as a as an element of that history. She's sort of the Gnostic Indiana Jones in that perspective. Like perhaps,
Yeah.
I'm vaguely.
Yeah. I mean, not in the sense that she like discovers it, but what she will do is, and why I think that was such a successful book. I mean, it's, on the one hand, she is writing as a scholar with that kind of view from nowhere, right? She's presenting arguments about what these things mean based on the reasonable scholarship, which does not depend on her person. But she also always includes in these books, and she did in Gnostic Gospels, she did in her book on Thomas, her own discovery and interaction with that, right? Her own sense of why this resonated with her in a particular time and place. It's never part of the argument she's making. I'm not saying this means this because it had this resonance with me, but I came to this and it had this resonance with me. And she talks about being a graduate student, which is just serendipity. She was at one of the three places in North America where they were actually had these texts,
Mhm.
right, that they could look at in full. I mean, Thomas had been published like in the 50s, but the rest of the codices took a little, in the 60s and 70s. So she was at one of the one places you could look at this stuff, and she had a real sense of resonance with what was happening there, which
Mhm.
she then historicized and made very clear scholarly arguments about. But I think that was one of the reasons that her presentation, besides also really working in a particular both theological but also political narrative of the 1970s, why it had that kind of resonance, because she was willing to pull that veil aside a little bit and say, here I am, the person with
Mhm.
these particular motives and desires, and this is why this resonated with me.
Mhm. Mhm. Also, just as an aside, when you were discussing the two different tropes of the academic,
Yeah.
there was so I'm in Calgary. Well, yeah, right now I'm not exactly, but I lived in Calgary, Alberta, and we just had a production of the Da Vinci Code as a stage play here in Calgary. And
Neat.
a friend, pardon me.
Neat.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I mean, it was definitely like it was a blockbuster play. Like it had video projection and like sets that rotated in complicated
Yeah.
ways, and you were like, this is the company put a lot of money into it and investment into it, and the audiences really were like excited for this thing. And I'm like, this is not a new story, but see it on stage, that was interesting, and the actors did a great job, many of which were my friends. But what I noted was that the protagonist, and I can't even remember if I would have said this about Tom Hanks in the film, and I don't know if I've ever read the book, so I don't even know if this is a thing in the book, but in the production, this theater production, the Robert Langdon character is definitely more in the nerdy, pale, easily distracted, like not like he's ever trying to hold anything. He's never trying to keep anything back, and he's trying to uncover a lot of this stuff. um, but nearly feminized, if that makes sense, in a patriarchal sense. Like he's often the least skilled in any action scene. He was like fumbling and stumbling and worried, and whereas like the female partner there is like drop kicking people and taking guns out of people, and you know what I mean. And
Yeah.
it was that was something I think really interesting and notable for him to ostensibly be the protagonist and yet to be so nearly unagentic. Like he's drawn into all of this. He didn't even like. It's not like, yes, I can finally talk about the conspiracy I've been puzzling through this whole time. It's more like I happen to be here and I happen to get a text message and whoop, here we go. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of interesting for that specific story. I don't know. Is that is that representing the novel? Would
Yeah,
you
it's
say?
interesting. You definitely have the protagonist who stumbles upon things, who's not particularly resourceful either in terms of what they know or what they can do, but
Mhm.
are just propelled forward by various things. It's rare to have the academic be. Langdon is an interesting character because in the book, he is very much he knows lots of stuff, but he's very skeptical of everything. So the idea that he's being
Mhm.
pulled into this world of conspiracy against his will, right?
Mm.
Basically because this guy's been killed and he's a suspect. And so
Yeah.
it begins a very personal motive for him. I did not kill this French man, even though my name is on him and I was supposed to be the last person to meet him. But it is definitely the case that when you do sometimes have these academics as protagonists in situations of danger, either they compensate by having them be this sort of physically resourceful type, the kind of archaeologist type who can punch someone,
Mhm.
or somehow the people around them compensate for that. I will say it's more typical to have this kind of offloading of the physical resourcefulness from a male protagonist onto a female sidekick in a lot of these novels set in Israel or with Israeli
Mm.
characters, Dead Sea Scrolls characters. So one of the things that happens is the representation of Israel in these novels, particularly from the 60s onward, um, the portrayal of Israelis in the context of newer discoveries is very fraught because
Mm.
US cultural depictions of Israel are particularly fraught.
Mhm.
So you don't have in these novels a main character who is an Israeli academic. You never have
Mm.
that. That is never is the case. If they're an academic, they're from outside, or they're not an academic at all.
Mm.
Right. So we have some where it's an American archaeologist or an American scholar who's visiting and stumbles upon things, but they often end up it's someone who's just like a tech person, like a code breaker, right? So that makes
Mhm.
sense for them to be involved in trying to decipher this new copper scroll they found. But what you often get in a handful of these novels is the woman who is usually love interest, but yeah, usually the love interest, is herself an Israeli. She is often academic, like she has some kind of academic training, usually archaeological, but she's often military and she's highly skilled at that kind of physical defense. So she becomes this sort of image of a person of the sort of technocratic efficiency of the
Mhm.
state of Israel, not necessarily in terms of the knowledge that's being covered. They're very knowledgeable in terms of archaeology, but not necessarily interested in a Christian gospel.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and it becomes this very palatable image of the Middle East as a place that is dangerous, but also will somehow guide the Western scholar into the active recovery that's necessary for them. And part of
Oh,
this is an
wow.
attempt to moderate the image of the scholar soldier from really the 40s and 50s, like the kind of Yigael Yadin archaeologist. Like he was the one who uncovered Masada. His father was actually one of the ones who was Eliezer Sukenik, who was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars in what was not yet quite Israel when the scrolls were first
Mm.
uncovered. So deeply embedded in this sort of act of archaeological recovery for the state of Israel, not so useful if we're talking about a lost gospel in which the state of Israel has no interest. So it becomes a way to make that sort of new technocratic soldier archaeologist character of the state of Israel work for the recovery of a gospel truth without it being a kind of a man in competition with the male protagonist, right?
Oh, that is
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah,
So
like
we get a lot. Yeah.
the intersection of different, like, sort of anxieties and
Yes.
interests all kind of coalescing in that kind of an interesting trope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's part of the realities of archaeology in the state of Israel, right? Like
Mhm.
you can't just go in as this guy from the outside. Like there needs to be some kind of cooperation with the state. So how do you imagine that? Is it working against? And that's
Mhm.
true. In some novels, there are lots of conspiracies about the Dead Sea Scrolls from like day one that have to do with the state of Israel as being maybe an agent of suppression on its own or in conjunction with the Vatican, because
Mhm.
a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls work in the early decades was done by a group that was led by Catholics. And so there was this idea that like the Vatican could be suppressing stuff or maybe they work together to suppress certain things or allow certain things. This is one of the engines of conspiracy in a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls novels.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Sorry, that took a tangent, but yeah.
No, no.
That's great.
Yeah,
It's the
I mean,
tangent.
we're here for this. This is like
Yeah.
the this is exactly like, why we've been so excited to talk to you. Some of the thoughts that I'm having on this too are around the notion of like the going back to the totemic quality of the Bible, which is like you've also we haven't touched on this too much. You've noted occasionally, but like how this is also a very American totemizing thing, but that the
Yeah.
Bible itself, looking at it as like one thing that I've often thought about is that it's so tricky to look at this text as how would you put it, like it's almost like a 0 point of history, like that for a lot of folks it's like history starts at the Bible and goes forward, and that anything prior to that is like hazy and misty and not worth caring about.
Mm.
And so it's like basically 6 days for God to create heaven and earth, Jesus onwards, like that there's kind of it thinking about it as a history text as much as it is a theological text and a literary text,
Mhm.
which I think is interesting because that's often also what creates all of these tensions around the usefulness or validity of like when a text comes from, how it was translated, who edited it out or added it in, all of that kind of stuff. Because these are questions that that would not be as fraught. They would be important, but not as fraught if they were about Homer or if they were about the Eddas, the Norse Eddas, or something like that. Like, which like we could say had like for the Greeks, the Homeric epics were nearly biblical in terms of the amount of moral and ethical use and spiritual usefulness they got out of them. But as far as I know, there was never a reliance on them as also like a strictly historical text. And so I think that just creates such an interesting tension in terms of reliance. And yeah, I think I don't know. That's not really a question, I suppose, but it's something I'm kind of
No,
pulling a lot of what you're saying.
but I think you're right. And I think it gets to why the Gospels in particular, which are very narrative,
Hmm.
um, and because they're very narrative, and because both historians and people with a religious relationship with these texts understand this narrative to be accurate, even if a lot of the pieces can be interpreted in various ways. A lot of what this lost gospel discourse does is it's particularly about the narrative. Like
Hmm.
this thing didn't happen or this additional thing happened. It's not about detail, or it's not that it becomes particularly vulnerable at the point of narrative in a way
Hmm.
that other more mythopoetic texts don't have to be vulnerable in that way, right? Because they don't
Yeah.
have that kind of simple narrative line that gives them a sense of graspability, but also kind of truthfulness. That there's a
Hmm.
clear, even though even amongst themselves, the four gospels don't agree on that narrative necessarily. You can make them agree if you need to, or you can explain why they might have different perspectives on when the thing happened. But the narrativeness of it. So a lot of the gospels are about events in the life of Jesus or events in the lives of the apostles following the death of Jesus, which
Hmm.
then would disrupt the narrative authenticity. And once you disrupt the narrative authenticity, the whole thing comes into question. So it becomes this particular point of vulnerability that the narrative / historical aspect of the
Hmm.
gospels, which is so prominent. I mean, it's striking when you read them with other sort of texts about sort of mythopoetic figures. They're very like point A, point B, point C, like this happened kind of narratives.
Hmm. And that's like in many ways, I don't know. I'm freestyling a little here, but I think that's also probably part of both like the spread or the I don't know the viral nature of like the whole Christian process, like from the like crucifixion onwards, has been this excitement slash need to meld history to story, to narrative, to theology, um, in this way that is both so compelling, but it's been vulnerable for 2,000 years, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. It's never not been vulnerable.
Yep.
I remember listening to the History of Rome podcast, and which at a certain point, I think like also is kind of the History of Christianity podcast. And he's not positioning it that way at all. He's focused on Rome. But at a certain point, most of what's going on in Rome is in dealing with Christian politics. And I remember at one point he was saying something like in the early, I don't know, 200s or 100s or something, that said like some Roman historian said there's no animal more rabid than Christians with each other, because they were attacking each other over like if Jesus was physical or not,
Mhm.
and that like that only makes sense. I don't think it makes sense, but it only can make sense if you need it to be triangulated, if theology, narrative, and history are all triangulating in a specific real place, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things about Christianity in antiquity, but then certainly when we get to this sort of modern moment,
Mhm.
is both the problem and the benefit of textuality, right? So this was from
Mm.
very early on. Christianity was a very small movement, very mobile in lots of, we might say, small cells in lots of places. And one of the ways it could have a sense of its own continuity and contiguity with other Christians in other places was through text, right? At some point, that becomes seemingly important to at least a lot of the Christians we know about. Presumably, there are lots of
Mhm.
Christians from that is not true, but textuality becomes really key. Textuality, as Plato told us a long time ago, is both important but also so easy to falsify, right? Like
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
nothing easier to falsify than a text. To falsify my speech, you would have to misrepresent what someone else might have heard me say. To falsify a text, you just have to change the text. And it is both one of the most durable and unreliable forms of communication transmission, so says Plato, right?
Mhm.
And the idea that has been so textual, and again, I can't say this is true for all Christians, but certainly for Christians for whom Gospels and then Paul's letters and then the Bible are central to what makes Christians have something in common,
Mhm.
is both an incredible benefit because it provides this common resource, but then in various times and various places, and we can see this in antiquity, there's anxiety about the text of the Bible already in the 200s, again
Mhm.
in the 400s, of course, in the Middle Ages. Like this is just over and over again in different ways and forms. What changes in the modern period is this advent of the modern critical attempt to reconstruct. So instead of amending what you have to be correct, this is obviously wrong because it was theologically correct, or I
Mhm.
heard a different, better version somewhere else. It's now about bringing together in a sort of quasi scientific way all the evidence and processing the evidence to producing the new true thing. That, again, it's just a new way to process this same old benefit slash problem of the textuality of Christianity. And
Yeah.
again, not true for all Christians in all times and places, right? For a lot of
Mhm.
Christians, the Bible is either not a text, right? It is a set of stories or a set of whatever. This textuality is secondary, if important at all, if not all important. Um, but for the particular, especially Protestant Christians, the
Mhm.
text is
Mhm.
absolutely central. And so its centrality makes it this key point of vulnerability. Yeah.
Mm.
For instance, there are other novels that I came across just to give an interesting comparison. And in fact, one of the authors who wrote sort of two different gospel thrillers in one of these series also wrote one of these. There are Jesus body thrillers,
Yeah.
right? What if Jesus's body was discovered?
Yeah.
There's also like a Tom Robbins novel, which is just sort of a funny novel. In other words, Attraction, which is also, but this is a thing. Like
Mhm.
if this body is discovered, that's game over, right? There's no resurrection. And this is not at all a textual argument. This is
Mhm.
discovering the physical remains that should not be on Earth. And there's probably like 4 or 5 novels like this I've read from the 60s and 70s. It's the same sort of general idea. There's a conspiracy, there's shadowy forces, there's a race against time to find this body, but it's not centered on the text, right? It's not a discovery of a new written source that then shows how the existing written sources have been falsified or suppressed in certain ways.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating. That also makes me think of like because that at least it did that Da Vinci Code plot point of the bloodline of Jesus is also like it's not quite as heretical as like finding the body, but it is like it is implying a bodiness of Jesus that people would probably rather not think about, you
Mhm.
know. And again, this was one of the things that people were killing each other over 1800 years ago was the how much body Jesus had, like whether or not, like maybe they were debating then, could Jesus have had kids?
To be fair, as a historian of
Yeah.
early Christianity, I have to say I don't know that Christians were killing each other
Yeah.
over these things.
Okay.
I
Okay.
do think there have been arguments lately that a lot of what we perceive when there were state actions against Christians, it is likely
Mhm.
that some Christians were turning in other Christians. Like that was one of the dynamics going on in terms of what we think of as persecution. So it could be that they were leveraging state violence against their fellow Christians. But I just
Mhm.
don't want us to imagine like actual like pitched battles between Christians. The second, it actually takes a while for Christians to kill other Christians for heresy. A surprisingly long time, maybe, but
Okay.
yeah,
I am
Sure.
happy to be corrected. Yeah.
yeah,
But they're arguing. They're arguing. So you're right
they're
there.
100% arguing. And I wouldn't say there's violence. I will say Christians probably beat each other up quite a lot, and Christians do beat each other up to the point where maybe someone dies of injuries. I will allow
Mhm.
that. There's a council in the 5th century where, by this point in the sort of ecumenical councils of the 400s, there's a council in 449 where at this point the routine presence of kind of monks as shock troops is so like they're just bringing all their sort of guys and there's fights in the street and the bishop gets beat up so bad that he does later die. So I will give
Mhm.
you that. But I just don't
Okay.
want to think that there's actual like pitched battles of Christians versus Christians. Yeah. It's a very
Fair.
violent time. Christians were not immune from the violence of the time. And yeah.
Well, and that there wasn't like a unified perspective in
Yeah.
this.
Oh,
Yeah.
no. Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
there wasn't the church, right? That had that had
Well, there
okay.
were two things going on. There was definitely the sense among some Christians that there was a thing called the church.
Oh.
And it was absolutely true that that thing was something that they were trying to will into existence that did not necessarily exist on the ground. So those two things, which are in absolute tension with each other, are both true throughout, I would say, most of the history of Christianity. I think the rise of denominationalism in the 17th century was this sort of release valve that, and okay, I guess we can all stop now killing each other all the time. You do your thing, we'll do our thing, and we'll all just agree to be Christian separately. Um,
Mhm.
uh, yes, when you have an idea of unified orthodoxy and a reality of total diversity, that is a recipe for lots of shenanigans, for sure.
Completely. Well, and even again, like another thread to pull in there too. Earl from the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast. That was harder to say than I expected. Or Schwepp. Earl Fontanelle made a point in one of his episodes about that there was this tricky period as Christianity was kind of growing, where the non-Roman or the non-Christian Romans were like, why are these Christians insisting that their God is also my God, or is more real than my God? Like this insistence on a blanket reality, like on a blanket theology that covers everybody, versus a kind of like I think this is probably debatable, but the Romans probably were like, sure, it's all a bit of a mess. Your Zeus is our whatever. Let's not worry about it. Just pay your taxes, But then that's yeah. So I think there's sort of an interesting
Yeah.
thing. Again, this notion of the history, theology, and narrative, um, all insisting on each other in a way that feels like it was a very unique thing at that time.
Yes. Well, unique as far as we know, and certainly in its success. So that is
Yeah.
absolutely something Christians start doing in the 200s and 300s is re-narrating a kind of global history such that it is a Christian history.
Hmm.
And the technical term we use is like a totalizing view. Like there's nothing outside
Yeah.
of Christian truth
Hmm.
except error. right? So
Mhm.
you can't agree to disagree. You can just be wrong, or you can be correct, and you can
Yeah.
accept this totalizing viewpoint of the world, which will be fully explanatory of um, history and politics and truth, or you can persist in error, which, you know, that
Mhm.
you're just wrong, right? But
And
there's definitely this attempt to re-narrate not just the individual history of Christianity, but by the 300s for sure, that this history is, in fact, this is a totalizing cosmic history,
Mhm.
which has come
Mhm.
to fruition in particular ways since the life of Jesus.
When I was going through your text, that I didn't find a reference to was Umberto Eco, like with Foucault's Pendulum, which I guess is not necessarily a biblical thriller. It's more of a general esoteric thriller in
Yeah.
that sense. But if only because I think when somebody asked him about his thoughts of the Da Vinci Code, he said that I think what's the author of the Da Vinci Code? Dan Brown.
And,
Dan Brown is one of my creatures. Dan Brown is one of the people, or maybe Robert Langdon as well, is one of the people he is lampooning in Foucault's Pendulum. But I just thought that was, I guess it was it ever, was that ever something that was texts that are looking at this gospel thriller thing? Did that ever come into your process in researching this, or?
I
Um,
mean, I read Foucault's Pendulum, right, like when it came out, and I
yeah.
think what is brilliant about Echo's take on conspiracy is its contemptless self-perpetuation. So the sort of surprise ending, spoiler for Foucault's Pendulum, is that none of this is real, right? All these people have imagined themselves into a conspiracy based on really, I mean, it's actually funny now I think of it, they have a computer program that just is generating likely prose, right? It's recombining random text into sentences, and it's leading these group of guys in Italy to come up with conspiracy theories that then the people who believe that they are part of them start to believe. So it's this
Mhm.
recursive loop of generative AI basically producing a false conspiracy when it exists, but that becomes really violent because these people want to think that this thing is true about them. So I think that was probably formative for me to think about the aesthetics of conspiracy. This is something that lots of people smarter than I have written about, is there's a particular aesthetics to conspiratorial thinking, which makes it functionally unending because it relies on
Mhm.
clues that lead to other clues. You see this a little bit in something like the Da Vinci Code, which has these little, what are they, cryptics, whatever they're called, the little code boxes that
Oh,
keep
yeah.
finding. That's just a very physical representation of what is generally what conspiracy theories, both in real life and in fiction, do, which is
Mhm.
they have clues that lead to other clues that lead to other clues. And every clue brings you further closer to the truth, but that truth is a horizon, right? You're not going to reach it.
Mhm.
You will just be endlessly generating clues. So one of the things that it's both pleasurable about conspiracy, but also frustrating for a lot of conspiracists is its unending quality. You cannot solve a conspiracy. This is
Mhm.
why fictional representations of conspiracy can be particularly satisfying. So the thriller genre offers a kind of closure that actual conspiratorial thinking cannot offer. QAnon is not going to end, right?
Mhm.
Even though it is an apocalyptic vision of an end that's coming, that end that QAnon envisions is a horizon. Whereas,
Mhm.
even though in a lot of these novels, there is a sense that the larger shadowy forces will continue their work, this particular chapter of this particular conspiracy ends when you close the book or when the credits roll on the movie.
Mhm.
And that gives you a sense of satisfaction and closure that actual conspiracy in the real world cannot offer you. So that's one of the
Mhm.
aesthetic pleasures. I think what Eco did really brilliantly in Foucault's Pendulum is he even defers that kind of closure because
Mhm.
the narrator is telling you the story in real time and you don't know what's going to happen. Like he's waiting for something to come at the end, again, spoiler, at the end,
Yeah.
which, you know, maybe it's going to be his death, maybe he's going to get released, maybe he'll escape, something like that. So,
Mhm.
um, and again, I think this dovetails with the kind of, just to bring it back to the gospel thrillers give you this kind of closure. They give you this opportunity to imagine the panic and chaos and fear of a new discovery that could disrupt the Bible, but you close the book, right? And it is
Mhm.
absolutely fictional. This is where I think I talk about the Da Vinci Code some, but not so much in the book because the Da Vinci Code doesn't do this. The Da Vinci Code's trying to bring you real sources that could then be a real conspiracy, right? That's page one, like this is fact or something like that on the first page of
Mhm.
the Da Vinci Code. This is gospel thrillers are highly fact-based and absolutely fictional. It's a fictional gospel, and I should say fake. It's a fictional gospel.
Mhm.
It's a fictional story. It begins, it has a middle, it has an end, and it satisfies that sort of pang of fear for and desire for the vulnerable Bible in a very contained way.
Hmm.
So I think that's why this is a persistent genre. It's seen, as we said at the beginning, no one calls them this except me. Um, it seems to go on forever. These books do not seem to be particularly aware of each other. No one's no one's self-consciously writing in the genre. They're just writing a thriller with the Bible at the
Hmm.
center, and it tends to follow these same steps because these are the itches that writers and readers want scratched in terms of the
Hmm.
vulnerability of the Bible. So I assume they'll just keep going. That's why I needed to finish writing my book, because I could not keep taking copious notes on these until the end of time.
Yeah. I mean, now you'll have to write a sequel as more of these books come out, and so now you will become the character.
So
Um,
hopefully they're formulaic enough that this will suit. You can read a new one and read my book with it, and it will still nothing will
you could
change.
continue going. There's also, I think, Jonathan. I'll wrap up my notes and then I'll let you go with the last. Is there's one thing I really call anybody who's a interested in Gnosticism or calls themselves a Gnostic to, I can show my bias here is that I think embrace this vulnerability of text. Not embracing it can only leads to difficulty for these characters, and I mean excitement and adventure in the novel, but that's the idea of thinking about a text as specifically and requiring a certain kind of truth from it is only ever going to make a text more vulnerable to the point where it might break on you. So that's my own personal take on a lot of this. And and I think also I just also want to say too is that like John and and so many other Gnostics are also like, this is catnip for us. More details, more facts, more history, more stuff to uncover, more evidence. So there's also like I get the appeal, I get the understanding of what it is to like to find something in a footnote that no one else had found before, and then think that might change everything. That's exciting. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's my little
it's
end there.
it's very human and very motivating, for me personally, and I've even had some of those mini epiphanies, right? Being like, and there's an example someday I'll talk about on the show where I'm like, "This is gonna change everything," and then I realize, "No, wait, it's not." But maybe a few people will find it interesting. Anyways, I think we're probably at wrap-up point. The name of the book, the full name of the book, is Gospel Thrillers: Conspiracy Fiction and Vulnerable Bible. You can buy it wherever books are sold. Also, I always forget to say this, if you're a little tight right now, you can request at the library for them to buy a copy. So
Mhm.
most libraries actually have a form on their website. So fill out that form, tell them to buy a copy. Dr. Jacobs, anything else you want to tell people where they can find you online? Any upcoming projects you might be interested in? Any plugs, anything like that?
Oh, nothing to plug. I mean, you can find me online at andrewjacobs.org, and you can find all about me on my .org website. But yeah, this was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Oh,
Thank you
good.
guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Likewise.
yeah. Likewise, yeah. We had a lot of fun and learned a lot. So it's an excellent book, folks. Go out and buy it.
Thank
Slash,
you.
get your library to buy it. Tell all your friends to buy it. And thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Jacobs.
Thanks.
Take care.